Good morning, everybody. 10 things you didn't know happened in Plainfield. There might be a little bit more than 10, but it'll be interesting. The unspoken, buried, and forgotten stories of Plainfield, Queen City Tales. Thank you, Sarah, and for all the work that you do to help coordinate these programs and for suggesting this one to me. Thanks to all of you who have signed on and for your interest in local history. I appreciate your support. This is a compilation of short stories about Plainfield, places, people, and events that are relatively unknown. True stories that have been uncovered through years of research, following leads, tidbits, and clues to find some answers to people's questions. Through these stories, you will see what influenced the fabric of life in Plainfield. Ordinary people who had a significant impact on Plainfield and the nation. Tidbits that pique my curiosity. I hope that you will find them interesting. Most happened in Plainfield and others had their roots in Plainfield. One of my friends, Molly Banta, a former history teacher at Plainfield High School in Paz, and I would always talk about the impact of Plainfield on the United States. We always said we would write a history book about national and world events that could trace a story back to Plainfield. Unfortunately, she passed away, as well as Paul Pannone and Tiffany Corbett, both Plainfield High School teachers with whom I would share history stories. I dedicate this program to all three of them. Native Americans. Did you know that as you traverse the streets and land of Plainfield that you are walking along paths and areas that Native Americans originally settled? In this 1915 map by Leslie Spear, you can see where the Native Americans wintered. They wintered along the Cedar Brook, Green Brook, and the Bound Brook. The most campsites were along the Green Brook in the west end of Plainfield. I consider this area sacred ground. Leslie Spear, 1893 to 1961, he was an anthropologist and was in his early 20s when he researched this area. He talked about this being the Unami region. Unami was the language of the Lenape. These sites he attributed to small traveling bands, and more research is needed to attribute the sites to the proper bands of Native people. His work is mentioned in a history booklet, Where the Green Brook Meets the Raritan, by the New York District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 2012 for the Green Brook Flood Damage Reduction Project. This information will be used again when the new Green Brook Flood Control Project makes its way east. The Historical Society, along with the library and other Plainfield groups, are consulting parties for the Green Brook Upper Basin Flood Risk Management Project draft reevaluation report. The flood project hopefully will require a thorough review of the area, some archaeology, and perhaps the modern technology. More detailed information will be discovered about the Native people. Drake House and Caesar. Did you know that Isaac Drake, Nathaniel Drake's father, freed his enslaved people? Most people know the story of Drake House and Caesar. The 1.5-story farmhouse was built in 1746 by Isaac Drake for his son Nathaniel as a wedding present. The Drakes did own enslaved people. In the Society's collection is Isaac Drake's will from 1759, which is the legal document that immediately freed Kate. Tom, Tone, and Caesar were freed after 10 years in 1769. The laws were complicated, and Isaac was required to provide for all of them. As a friend of a friend has told me, they were only free on the Drake's land, always having to look over their shoulder if they left the Drake property. I am working on a census of enslaved people in the area to give them a name and for them to be seen. You will see a map on another slide of the landowners in the area, and so far I've discovered that not all of the area residents of that time owned enslaved people. More research is needed to be done. Unfortunately, no diaries or records have been found to indicate why Isaac decided to free his enslaved people. My conjecture is his religious beliefs may have played a part in his decision. Isaac's father was Reverend John Drake, who was the first Baptist minister in New Jersey. It is significant that Isaac had his intentions written down and duly recorded for people hundreds of years later to read and contemplate. He included the words, never to be confined again as slaves. It is not known if Isaac freed Kate, Tom, Tone, and Caesar before his death, or if this was the only way that he could legally free them. Did you know that the parishioners of Scotch Plains Baptist Church furnished Caesar's grave marker? These are photographs of Caesar's grave marker, which is located in the Scotch Plains Baptist Cemetery. Caesar's original stone is the red sandstone. It broke in half, and many years the pieces were separated until Reverend Chaz was able to match the pieces. The pieces are safely stored in the church complex, and the pieces in these photos are recently placed together for photographs for a future Netherwood Heights neighbors calendar and for the Scotch Plains Historical Society. It was quite a moving experience to witness. A replica stone was made by a local sorority. Caesar was a United States veteran, has a United States veteran military marker. Dr. Veit of Monmouth University, who has written books on New Jersey cemeteries, believes this may be the oldest surviving marker of an African American in New Jersey. The oval plaque is located in the cemetery and lists the names of the Revolutionary War soldiers. Caesar's name is a different color because the church insisted that his name be placed on the monument when it was erected by the DAR during the Jim Crow era. The parishioners of the church erected the original grave marker. It is not known if Caesar had any surviving relatives. No descendants of Caesar, Kate, Tom, or Tone have ever visited the Drake house. Did you know that a Drake descendant played a part in the Dred Scott decision? I stumbled on this while watching a C-SPAN history show when they talked about the Drake Constitution in Missouri. I knew that some of the Drakes had moved west, and much to my surprise, I could trace his story back to Plainfield. This is one of the stories that illustrates Plainfield's reach. Charles Daniel Drake was the great-grandson of Nathaniel. His father, Daniel, at the age of 2, left Plainfield in 1788 with his father, Isaac, and 2 uncles and their families. They went by wagon and finally settled in Mayslick, Kentucky. The 3 Drake sons who had served in the Revolutionary War did not like Nathaniel's younger second wife after Nathaniel's first wife died, so they packed up their families and left for the West. Charles Daniel Drake's father was a doctor and eventually settled in Cincinnati, Ohio. Charles was born in Cincinnati and moved to St. Louis, Missouri in 1834. He was complex and at one time supported slavery, but later became an emancipator. He was a United States Senator from Missouri. He was a Chief Justice of the Court of Claims. And in 1865, he wrote the Drake Constitution, which abolished slavery in the state of Missouri. He was married to Martha Ella Blow, and the Blow siblings were the children of Dred Scott's former owner. And eventually they became involved in the Dred Scott case. After Charles's wife died, her sister took care of his young children, and it's thought that her sister requested Charles Daniel Drake's assistance in the Dred Scott case. Drake took the depositions for Dred and Harriet Scott in 1847. There are no indications that Charles Daniel Drake was involved in the case in any other way, as the case took years to be settled. The Dred Scott case was one of the most controversial Supreme Court cases. The court ruled against Dred Scott and Harriet Scott and decided that African Americans were not citizens. Isaac Drake and Charles Drake had flaws, but they both had changes in consciousness later in life about slavery. Did you know that the subsequent owners of the Drake House influenced local houses of worship? John S. Harburger was the second owner of the Drake House. He was a banker and elected president of the Manhattan Bank, now J.P. Morgan Chase. He was one of the original members of the Washington Association, which saved the Ford Mansion in Morristown. He was a great supporter of St. Mary's Church, and he died in 1880. The Frucht family, Rose and Sigmund Frucht, only owned the Drake House for 3 years, and their descendants told me that Rosa did not like the Drake House because she considered it, quote, too old. The Frucht adult children lived a few doors away on West Front Street, which might explain the purchase of the Drake House. Sigmund owned a bicycle shop in Plainfield and was a bit of a character. He rented out the house, and you will learn more about that later. Sigmund was one of the early Jewish families in Plainfield who settled in the West End. He helped to place the cornerstone of the synagogue on New Street, and that still exists on New Street. The 3 families who were owners of the Drake House each had strong religious beliefs and were supporters of 3 different religions. 2 helped build houses of worship with contributions, and the other was a deacon in the Baptist church. Caesar was a revered member of the Baptist church. I do not think many other local historic houses can say the same. Did you know that Plainfield played a significant role in the Revolutionary War and quasi-war? I consider this the lost fort. This is a copy of a map by Captain Cornelius Vermeil in 1778. The original map is lost. The Vermeil family owned the land where the fort and encampment were located. The Vermeils lived on a plantation at the corner of Greenbrook Road and Clinton Avenue in North Plainfield. The original house is no longer standing. In its place is the Vermeil Brunson Mansion. But North Plainfield has two other Vermeil family residences still in existence, one on Greenbrook Road toward Rock Avenue and one on Mountain View Terrace. There are also two Cadmus homes still in existence, one on a hill on Greenbrook Road and Crossan Place, and one on Myrtle Avenue bordering the Greenbrook Park extension. All four of these homes are private residences which have survived over 200 years. The Vermeil family and Cadmus family were related. Another Vermeil home is located in Greenbrook on Rock Avenue near Greenbrook Road. Dr. John Vermeil's house. It is run by the Greenbrook Historical Society and worth a visit. The Vermeil family still has a footprint in this area, even though most people do not know their name. This map copy is a treasure because it's the only known map that gives the location of the encampment. I mentioned this map earlier when I talked about enslaved people. My research so far into the property owners surrounding encampment indicates that not all of them owned enslaved people. Some were Quakers. Locating the names of enslaved people is difficult because this map includes two counties, Essex and Somerset, and this area is basically wilderness at the time. Union County did not exist until 1857. Many manumission records, if they exist, are not indexed. They are tedious to read, and sometimes the cursive writing is illegible. This is the plaque in Greenbrook Park that commemorates the soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War and were stationed there. It was a militia post, also known as Quibbletown or at the Vermeils. What the plaque says is site of the Blue Hills Fort and encampment. This marker is erected in the memory of the brave Revolutionary soldiers from the vicinity who garrisoned this fort, harassing and repulsing the invading enemy for 7 months. During the darkest period of the war, from this outpost, General Washington on June 26, 1777, finally turned back the whole British Army, compelling them to evacuate the state. This was erected by the Continental Chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1924. Men stationed at this militia post participated in the Battle of Spanktown, Battle of Quibbletown, Battle of Short Hills, all held in 1777. They participated in the Battle of Springfield in 1780. The men returned to the fort after the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. Troops passed on their way to the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The garrison fluctuated between 1,000 and 2,000 men. Troops that were stationed there included the militia of the Morris and Sussex County, the 1st Essex Regiment, the 1st Somerset, Hunterdon, and the 1st Middlesex Regiment. I must thank my friend Rich Palmetier for helping to replace the plaque that was stolen in 2010. Union Camp. What is interesting about this militia post in Greenbrook Park area is that both George Washington and Alexander Hamilton remembered this militia post when the United States was contemplating a war with France, the quasi-war from 1798 to 1801. This was a limited naval war against French privateers who were seizing U.S. ships in the Caribbean. War was never formally declared. Washington was brought out of retirement by President John Adams because Adams needed Washington's military expertise. Hamilton was appointed Major General by Adams. Washington and Hamilton needed a supply fort, so the United States purchased the 99 acres from the Vermeil family. This slide shows that in 1802, there was an act of Congress to sell the land back to the Vermeil family. It also shows an ad for the Swift Shore Line, which was the stage line between Philadelphia and New York. And if you look closely, it shows there was a stop for the Union Camp, which was the encampment. Both Hamilton and Abigail Adams visited the troops at the encampment. Abigail arrived by stage. Abigail Adams' daughter, Abigail Nabby Adams, was married to the commander of the encampment, William Stephen Smith. Hamilton was in the area for a week or more, but it's not known where he stayed. His tent did not arrive on time, and he stayed at a local home, but the location has not been found. More information about this can be found on the library's YouTube channel. John Daniel, a Vermeil descendant, did a talk about the Blue Hills Militia Post, and Ryan Radis did a talk about Hamilton at the Union Camp. We recently found about a month ago. This is an original receipt for the 45 acres of the land. This receipt was found by Jay Ruffley, who is an independent researcher. The document is from the Princeton University and the Firestone Library Special Collections. This is a receipt from the United States to Eder Vermeil for 45 acres of the land in the amount of $2,250. That would equal approximately $56,218 today. The receipt is dated October 12th, 1799. This slide represents one of Alexander Hamilton's visit. It also indicates that that Abigail Adams came. Where you see at the bottom, it says the troops were paraded for the president's lady. This comes from Seeley Diary, the diary of Savannah Seeley, that's located in the Morristown, New Jersey, Morristown National Historical Park Library. Hamilton came, one of his visits was October 8th, 1799, and Abigail Adams came June 7th, 1800. And Alexander Hamilton made many visits to this encampment. Did you know that there are forgotten cemeteries and burial grounds in Plainfield? A skeleton identified as a Native American was found at the end of Myrtle Avenue in 1954. I was told about this by a neighbor many years ago, and it took me a while to confirm the story. I have been in touch with the state police lab, but they have no records of where the skeleton is now. I also have been in touch with the state museum and state archaeologists, but so far the skeleton has not been located. At that time, it was identified as a Native American. And then you'll see this Courier News article. Halstead Compton was a farmer who owned a lot of the land in the area. His house still stands on West Front Street. And also he had homes on Compton Avenue. And he remembered that when he plowed his land, he would find bones. And he wasn't sure if they were Native American or Revolutionary War soldiers from the Quasi-War. And this article's from the Courier News in 1910. But I was able to establish that there were soldiers at the Quasi-War fort that died and could be buried somewhere in Greenbrook Park or along Myrtle Avenue. This one indicates that there was a soldier, John Steele, who was the second one that died at this encampment. And this is also from the diary of Savannah Seeley at the Morristown National Historic Park. The search for information about the sport and encampment has taken me over 40 years. A team of independent researchers, along with students from NJIT and their professor, and the Monmouth student and professor, have been working on this for the past 3 years. Efforts are being made to determine the outer boundaries of the encampment. The NJIT students and professor have been doing some GPS and satellite mapping, and Rich Palmetier has been an invaluable map expert in superimposing old maps on current day maps, and we are close to finding the exact outer boundaries of the encampment. The finding of the exact outer boundaries will be an exciting news for the 250th anniversary and will change the story of Revolutionary War and Quasi-War in this area. It is a significant fort and encampment because it protected Middlebrook to the west, Pluckham and Artillery Park to the north, the mountain passes in the Watchung Mountains, and it protected Morristown. Many books about this area leave this location out, misidentify the area, or hardly mention the Blue Hills Militia Post. Some of us are leaning toward the theory that this was a secret fort. People in the areas kept their mouths shut and simply did not reveal the location. Did you know that John Philip Sousa played his first concert in Plainfield after he left the Marine Corps? On September 28th, 1892, John Philip Sousa played his first concert after leaving the Marines in the Stillman Music Hall on West Front Street. It is not exactly known why he or his agent chose Plainfield. His agent's records are located in the New York Public Library, and there is a 9-day gap in the documentation in the week preceding the concert. The day after the concert, there was a post-concert press release in the Daily Press, and a comedian and personal friend of Sousa's, Frank Wilson, told Sousa a week before that, quote, "You will find the intelligence of a Plainfield audience far above average. In fact, as good as you will find anywhere. There are no country hayseeds out there, but they are as good as the best critics in the country," unquote. I recently discovered that Sousa was a Mason, and since Plainfield had a Masonic lodge, there may have been some friendly relationships with a local Mason. Also, I discovered that Harriet Ware, who was a woman composer, and her husband gave a dinner in Sousa's honor in 1919 when he was here for a trap shooting contest. She lived in the old Lampkins farm on Terrell Road. Sousa may have had other friendly connections to Plainfield, but that would take more research. Did you know that Plainfield High School was built on a cemetery? The high school was built on the Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery, as you can see from this photograph, the old Plainfield High School. The high school, this is a newspaper article that described the reasons why they picked this location. The site was purchased for $12,000, which would be about $419,500 today. They spent about $1,000 to remove the bodies, which would be about $34,900 today. Even the New York Times reported about Plainfield choosing this site for a high school. The reasons that were given in his newspaper article for the high school to be built on the cemetery was it was geographically the center of the city. It was the only lot size that big that could be found near the center, that it fronts on the city park, which is Library Park, and it couldn't be shut out by other buildings, and the open space would add to the beauty of the high school. It was easily accessible by trolley, and it would not be encroached by businesses and traffic from downtown. It was near the library. The cost was low, and the lot was big enough to allow for additions or expansion. And they said in the article, quote, "The soil has been examined and found to be clean gravel to a depth of at least 10 feet, unquote." This was buried in history. My friend Molly Banta told me that her mother and aunt, who went to Plainfield High School in the 40s, were forbidden to talk about it in school. There were so many stories that the teachers and students were absolutely forbidden to talk about the cemetery and the fact that the high school was built on it. This was erased from intellectual memory. When I went to Plainfield High School, we never knew. It was only a few years ago that stories began to emerge, and the maps and newspapers proved the story correct. The question remains, were the bodies removed? The headstones were, and have a request into the Seventh-day Baptist Archives for a list of the people who were interred in the cemetery. Some of the men at the time were on the Board of Education, and they were members of the church. Was there a backroom deal for the land? These are the Fitzrandolphs. The Fitzrandolphs were two of the people who had been buried in the Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery, and their headstones were moved to Hillside Cemetery. Many of the stones that were moved to Hillside are flat, like the Fitzrandolphs, and that is one clue to tell who was originally in the Seventh-day Baptist Cemetery. They lived in this little farmhouse that still exists on Randolph Road. Did you know that there are Civil War soldiers buried in Hillside Cemetery? There is a location in Hillside Cemetery that is dedicated to Civil War soldiers. It is the Grand Army of the Republic Post 73 burial plot. There are 33 Civil War veterans buried there, along with the wives of 4 of the men. If you drive into the cemetery, turn right at the vault and go past the maintenance area and look up the hill, you will see a flagpole and cannons up on the hill, and that is where the plot is. Martin Hurling, whose grave marker is depicted here, lived from 1841 to 1907. He is one of the soldiers who was buried in the circular section of the Grand Army Republic plot. He was a private in Company A in the 41st Regiment, United States Colored Troops Infantry. He was 18 years old, and he was a substitute for Oliver E. Gordon. Drafted men or enrolled men could hire substitutes. Substitutes were used by the rich during the Civil War. Not much is known about Oliver Gordon except that he was from New Brunswick and he was an attorney. Hurling was an ambulance driver and he survived the war. There are other cemeteries in Plainfield that contain Civil War veterans. And that is a depiction of his military record and also the fact that he was hired as a substitute. Did you know that the Gypsies would visit Plainfield? C.B. Riley, born in Bristol, Somersetshire, England, May 20th to 1824. She died February 3rd, 1904. On her tombstone, the inscription is, "Dearest mother, thou hast left us, and thy loss we deeply reel. But 'tis God who hath bereft us. He can all our sorrows heal." She is buried in the Hillside Cemetery. 1,500 people, curious townspeople, attended her funeral. Spectators were disappointed because there was a simple Episcopalian ceremony and nothing weird happened. People were expecting something strange to happen, but it didn't. The Riley, Cooper, and Harrison families of Gypsies camped throughout the city of Plainfield. They came from Florida, Maryland, Virginia, and one family came by train from San Francisco, California. Mother and Father Riley reigned as the king and queen of the Eastern Gypsies. Mother Riley specifically picked a pretty spot in Hillside Cemetery. She died in February and her body was held in the Hillside Cemetery vault until her burial. Her husband, who had died 10 years before, was buried in Auburn, New York, and was supposed to be disinterred and brought to Hillside Cemetery. Did you know that Plainfield was the home of a Titanic survivor? Benjamin J. Thomas is one of the reasons for this presentation. A couple of months ago, I received an email from Christine at the Hillside Cemetery. She asked me for information about two men, and one of them was Benjamin Thomas. It was a routine request, and much to my surprise, I found his obituary, and it mentioned he was the survivor of the Titanic. I couldn't believe it. How could that be? All the times I researched newspaper articles, I never saw anything about him. And as a young person, I was fascinated with the old movies about the Titanic. I think I even did a school book report on the Titanic. I knew that women and children were taken off first and that most of the men did not survive. After seeing his obituary, I still could not make sense of it because he was a man and a working class person. How did he get off the Titanic? I Googled him as a survivor and found the Titanic Encyclopedia webpage, and yes, he was a survivor. He was a saloon steward. He was rescued in Lifeboat 15, according to the Titanic Encyclopedia. Lifeboat 15 was the 8th boat lowered from the boat deck, where a lot of the crew got on. Evidently, an officer told the crew they could get on because the boat was not full. Most of the boat was filled with men, about 60 men, and there were 8 women and children in the boat. Boat 15 almost collided with boat 13 when it was lowered, but at the last moment, the collision was avoided. It took them about 20 minutes to row away from the sinking ship, and they picked up no one in the water on their way to the Carpathia. Boat 15 was the 10th or 11th boat to make it to Carpathia. He was not required to testify in either of the inquiries into the sinking. How and why he came to Plainfield is unknown. Benjamin's wife, Polly, and daughter, Bertha, age 5, came to join him in Plainfield in the fall of 1912, about 6 months after the sinking of the Titanic. He was in Plainfield when his wife and daughter came because it was noted on their Ellis Island arrival record. He first worked at International Motors as a machinist and then later got a job as a steward on the Pennsylvania Railroad. He died in Muhlenberg Hospital. I can only speculate that he had survivor guilt and simply did not talk about the Titanic. There was another article in the local paper when another survivor of the Titanic visited Plainfield, but there was never a mention of Benjamin in that article. Benjamin, a survivor of the Titanic, lived within sight of the Drake House on Brookside Place, and that's a picture of the house that he lived in. Evarts Tracy, did you know that Plainfield was the home to a camouflage officer of the United States Army in World War I? Lieutenant Colonel Evarts Tracy's tombstone reveals the man. Written on the tombstone is the inscription that sacred to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel Evarts Tracy, born New York, May 23rd, 1868, died Paris, January 31st, 1922. An architect in the service of beauty erected noble buildings, a soldier who in the service of his country won achievements expressing a valiant soul, as Major of Engineers, pioneer camouflage officer in the United States Army. He performed important labors, was twice cited for bravery in action, and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. As a man and a friend, he was loved. He lived on Hillside Avenue and was the architect of the old Muhlenberg Hospital, the old police station that still stands on Cleveland Avenue, and a number of houses in Plainfield. He also had a Titanic connection because he was the architect for the Isidore and Ida Strauss Memorial in New York City at Broadway and 106th Street. Ida remained on the Titanic with her husband when the ship sank. Evarts Tracy and his firm, Tracy and Stoutward, were architects for the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville, New Jersey, United States Post Office and Federal Building in Denver, Colorado, to name a few. What people need to realize with Evarts Tracy, prior to World War I, military ships were not camouflaged, and so he was one of the pioneering camouflage officers that camouflage ships and decided to make them so they wouldn't be as visible. The Red Scare and the Palmer Raids in 1920. Did you know that Plainfield was one of 36 cities that was raided during the Palmer Raids in 1920? There was always the story at the Drake House, in the Drake House timeline, that the house was raided and seditious material was found. This was during the time that the Fruck family owned the house. There was no concrete evidence until this past January when I stumbled upon an article in Courier News that Plainfield was part of the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids were a series of raids in November of 1919 and January 1920 by the U.S. Department of Justice under President Woodrow Wilson to capture and arrest suspected socialists, especially anarchists and communists, and deport them. The raids targeted Italian immigrants and Eastern European Jewish immigrants with leftist ties. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General, hence the name, and 6,000 people were arrested in 36 cities. About 556 people were deported. There were objections, especially from the United States Department of Labor, that had authority over deportations. There are more details about the Palmer raids, which can be Googled to learn more. Plainfield was one of the 36 cities, and the Drake House was raided, and seditious material was found, and one of the boarders was arrested and deported. Nikolai Bolson arrived on the SS Caronia Cunard Line on December 7th, 1913. He was detained at Ellis Island because he was an alien, and he was given a special hearing of inquiry, which shows on his arrival record. He was let in. I'm not sure what led him to Plainfield, and this is the article I found with his name and that he was arrested. He was sent back to Ellis Island to be deported. Other articles during that time mentioned the seditious material that was found. Some of the other men who were mentioned in this article were eventually released. I believe Nikolai was sent back because his name is not mentioned in his 1920 census record, and he essentially disappears. In the 1920 census record, there are 12 people living in the Drake House, 4 family units, and 1 boarder. Most worked in the factories and were Polish. This Palmer raid greatly upset Police Chief Kiley because he felt that George Washington had been disrespected. Shortly after the raid in the 1920 census, efforts began to save the Drake House. Did you know that KKK meetings were held in Plainfield? During the 1920s, there was a revival of the KKK, which was inspired by the 1915 movie Birth of a Nation. White, lower middle-class Protestant Americans in the North and the Midwest were fearful that American culture was changing due to immigrants, and the response was anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism. According to my mother, her parents faced anti-Catholicism when they purchased and moved to a neighboring town. A cross was burned on their lawn. Plainfield was not the center of KKK activity, but in 1920, KKK activity did occur in Plainfield. These articles illustrate the presence of the KKK in Plainfield. Trolley poles had signs in a recruitment effort. There was resistance because the signs were pulled down. An invitation-only meeting was held on East Front Street with a noted speaker, but his name was never announced to the public, and no one knows who that noted speaker was. People heard about it, and about 300 to 400 people gathered outside in protest. Police Chief Riley heard about the meeting and arrived on scene and had police in uniforms and plain clothes in the area. Young people managed to throw rocks, and after hearing that, Mayor Charles E. Lorizzo arrived, and both the mayor and police chief addressed the crowd inside and told them that there would be ample protection and no violence would be allowed. They then went outside and appealed to those outside to uphold the law and not bring disgrace upon the city of Plainfield. The outside crowd dispersed and only a few remained. The police provided protection to some people who left the meeting. It was said most of the men were from Jersey City, and the club hall that was rented said they had no idea what the meeting was about. The organizers denied that it was a membership meeting to organize a branch in Plainfield. The Courier News reported in an editorial that Mayor Loizzo said, quote, "One would think that the common sacrifices of the World War, sacrifices made by Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, by Black and white alike, should have removed from the heart of all who profess to be Americans any cause of misunderstanding, but alas, it seems not to be so." KKK funerals were reported in the local newspapers, as you can see here. In June 1926, the KKK wanted to hold a parade in Plainfield on July 3rd. They applied for a permit, but Chief Riley denied it based on the grounds that it would cause disorder. Based on that opinion, the then Mayor McMurray refused the permit. The organizers were disappointed, but police chief told the mayor that he would approve the permit if the members were unmasked. The KKK refused. It was reported in subsequent articles that a local minister allowed them to hold a meeting in his church on Grant Avenue. Did you know Plainfield once had a plane factory? Standard Aero Corporation had a factory on North Avenue in Plainfield. These two ads from Aerial Ad Weekly show the planes being made for the War Department in 1917. Later, in 1929, a local company, National Aircraft Company, designed a low-cost plane, the Air Cub. It was built in Pennsylvania, dismantled, and put back together for it to be displayed in the Cadillac showroom on East Fifth Street. It was considered a midget plane and designed by two Plainfield men, Milton C. Hodgins and Peter Abril. And there's a picture of where the old Cadillac showroom was. The building still exists in Plainfield. Did you know Louis Chevrolet settled for a time on Park Avenue in Plainfield? Louis Chevrolet was born in Switzerland and moved to the United States in 1901. He was vice president of American Motor Company, and there was a factory at West Front and Grant Avenue. He lived at 1232 Park Avenue, where the Chevrolet garage still stands. He lived there from 1916 to 1919. He and his brother Gaston were race car drivers, and his sister Martha was married to Albert Denoyers, who owned Denoyers Appliance on North Avenue and later moved the company to North Plainfield. The Chevrolet brothers designed their own racing car, the Frontenac Special, and they designed the American Motor 6, the only passenger car manufactured in Plainfield. They would use Johnson Drive in Watchung as a practice roadway. After his brother Gaston died in an auto race, Louis said goodbye to auto racing and began to work for the Stutz Motor Company of Indiana, which built Frontenac. Next Next week, the Chevrolet biographer from Switzerland is expected to be in Plainfield to take a look at the Chevrolet garage. The interior picture shows the metal ladder that leads up to the second floor of the garage. The garage is interesting because it has a barn-type door on the second floor, so items could be lifted to the second floor. This slide shows a calendar page from the Netherwood Heights 2003 calendar. And this calendar is about all the inventors that lived in Plainfield. And you can see some of the photos of the interior of his factory that was on West Front Street near Grant Avenue. The building no longer exists because during Hurricane Sandy, it got hit with a storm, and later there was a fire in the building. Did you know that America's first female cryptanalyst passed away in Plainfield? Although she was not born here or lived many years here, she passed away in the Abbott Manor nursing home. Her son lived a couple blocks from the Drake house in North Plainfield. I surmise he brought her here to live out her last days. Her story is amazing, and she was a 1999 Hall of Honor inductee at the NSA, the National Security Agency. She was born in Indiana, and her husband was also a code breaker. He got most of the credit until records were declassified and people found out about Mrs. Friedman. Books, PBS movie, and articles had now been written about her. Just Google her name and you will find a story about her. She deciphered enemy codes during both wars and helped solve international smuggling cases during Prohibition. She testified against gangsters and had her life threatened. She worked for the United States Treasury Department, the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Army. She was an unassuming woman who had a major influence on U.S. intelligence. This is an article talking about her when she helped the government, and she also helped the government in Canada to decipher codes. Did you know that a former Plainfield resident was responsible for the 1964 Civil Rights Act? Burke Marshall was born in Plainfield and he grew up on Prospect Avenue. He was an attorney and was the U.S. Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division during the Civil Rights Movement. He served under President John F. Kennedy and later Lyndon B. Johnson. He wrote the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in public facilities, in government, and employment. When his father died in 1969, Ethel and Ted Kennedy came to Plainfield for his father's funeral at Crescent Avenue Church. This was one of the first appearances in public for Ted Kennedy after the Chappaquiddick incident. They supposedly snuck in through one of the rear doors, side door. And there's a depiction of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that can be found in the Library of Congress National Archives. Did you know that Plainfield lost many men in World War II, and among the brave soldiers were Lieutenant S. Albert Black Jr., who was one of 4 Tuskegee airmen from Plainfield. He died in a training mission when the plane he was piloting crashed into the Ohio River near Madison, Indiana, in July of 1945. He was based at Goodman Field, Fort Knox. He is buried in Hillside Cemetery. Plainfield Tuskegee Airmen were Russell Carpenter, Warren Henry, and Charles Miller, who after their service contributed to life in Plainfield. Earl Morgan was a corporal in the segregated 7th to 84th Tank Battalion that liberated the Netherlands. He lived on West 2nd Street on the block across the street from the Drake House. He went to Plainfield High School. He is memorialized in a book, The Faces of Montgroton. They will remain forever young. He was killed in action on February 27, 1945 in his tank. He was 22 years old. He was survived by his parents, Mr. and Mrs. William Morgan, 4 brothers and 1 sister. While he was in Germany, one of his brothers was serving in Belgium and another brother was serving in France. I was recently contacted at the Drake House by the group in the Netherlands who wrote the book, and they included Earl in one of the 250 stories in the book. Both the library and the Drake House has a copy of the book. If you In a minute, you're going to see a video. If you watch closely, you will see Morgan in this video about the Netherlands American Cemetery and Memorial. The cemetery contains over 10,000 American soldiers.
Faces tell us so much. They may give you an insight as to how old someone is, the stresses and the strains that they have felt. Someone with dreams, someone with hopes, an individual that expresses love and is loved by many. Faces tell us every person is special.
It is an honor to welcome you to today's memorial ceremony.
Here at the Netherlands American Cemetery, we commemorate the lives of 10,023 Americans who gave their all for the cause of peace, freedom, and to quicken the end of the deadliest war the world has ever seen.
Although we look back on events that took place decades ago, a few family members are still with us, and the pain of their loss is just as real today as it was 70 years ago. Thank you from our family for what you have done today to remember Emmett's willingness to come to a place he didn't know, to fight in a war he didn't want to be in, and to do a job very few are willing to do. And what you've done today puts a human face to those long forgotten names.
That concludes my presentation. It's to be continued in the future. There's more stories about Plainfield. I hope you enjoyed it. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Thank you, Sarah.